Clark Phillips has what it takes to be a successful nickel cornerback in the NFL, but is Atlanta the right place and right scheme to get the most out of him? I've watched the film and we're breaking it down on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL, and when you enter the promo code LockedOnNFL, they'll throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti style tumbler with every order. And guys, we thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen. Make sure you follow in the footsteps of our everydayers. Shout out to them that follow or subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are continuing our breakdown of each and every one, all six of the Falcons draft picks, right? And today we're breaking down the fourth round selection in Clark Phillips. And frankly, up front, guys, I'll tell you that after doing the deep dive on the film, I wasn't as impressed with Clark Phillips as I was going into the process. So I'll break that down. But let's start with getting some background information on Clark Phillips. He was a four-star recruit that initially committed to Ohio State, then switched to Utah when defensive backs coach Jeff Hafley became the head coach at Boston College, one of the higher rated recruits that Utah had recruited. He got his first action during that COVID year, getting a pick six in that first year, and then recording three more over the next two seasons before he was done at Utah. Finished his career with 9 career interceptions and 21 pass breakups for a total of 30 pass breakups in 31 games, which is pretty impressive. Measured in at 5'9", 184 pounds at the combine, 29 and a quarter and 1/8 inch arms, putting him in the first percentile among cornerbacks. And according to Mock Draftable's database, only 5 cornerbacks over the last 10, 15 years that they have pretty substantial arm length data have measured in with shorter arms. Then Phillips ran a 4.51 40, which is 44th percentile, so roughly average speed, 33-inch vertical, 13th percentile, a 4.32 short shuttle at the combine, which is only 17th percentile in that agility drill, but did improve that to a 4.21 second short shuttle at his pro day, which is 41st percentile. So again, average agility, and that reflected in his relative athletic score, or RAS or RAS, which is a 5.60, and most of that was due to him doing impressive on the bench press and having good 10 and 20-yard splits, but pretty much was a below average athlete for the quarterback position across the other areas he tested. We'll get into it, but my overall takeaway of watching the film of Clark Phillips was I was a little bit lower on him, and I think that lack of athleticism did show up on his film a number of times. I did wind up watching 7 games from this past year, as well as 2 from 2021. And I want to see him against Drake London last year, and as well as those Ohio State receivers in that Rose Bowl game last year when he was just a sophomore. And, the narrative around Clark Phillips when we drafted him, and you heard me echo this and other people echo this on the podcast after we drafted him, was this notion that Clark Phillips was a top 50 talent that quote unquote fell to the 4th round. And I don't know if I buy that anymore. I feel like now sitting there watching the film that the 4th round was kind of where Clark Phillips was supposed to get drafted all along. And that's kind of what, the point of these deep dives is you watch 2 games in December and you come to the conclusion then based off of a pretty cursory look at the player that, oh yeah, he's pretty good. He's being mocked in the top 50. He seems like he fits in that. And then, you wind up watching 9 games in May and June and you say, oh, okay, like maybe he didn't necessarily need to be mocked that high. And, before we get into what I saw on the film with Clark Phillips, I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer when it comes to my own evaluation of cornerbacks. I've been, an amateur evaluator for roughly 20 years, over 20 years. And historically speaking, cornerback has been the position that I've had a lot more I've been very hit and miss on, right? Probably my worst position, even maybe worse in terms of my hit rate on evaluating cornerbacks, worse than quarterbacks, right? Which is generally considered the hardest position to evaluate. Although I do think in recent years, really 2018 was probably the last year where I was really off, right? That was the year where I had Mike Hughes, current Falcon legend, as my CB1 over players like Denzel Ward and Jair Alexander. I was also very high on Isaiah Oliver in that draft, maybe not as high as other people were that had him as the top corner in that draft class. And I feel like I've been better since then. That was probably the last draft where it was way off mark. And I feel like I've had more hits than misses in the years since. But, part of the reason I figure my cornerback hit rate is as bad as it's been over the years is because I don't feel like I have that strong an understanding of the more technical aspects of playing the cornerback position, right? And that contrasts with, say, offensive line and defensive line, where my hit rate is generally good, if not very high, probably higher for offensive line than it probably is for defensive line. And I think a lot of that is owed to I have a basic understanding, and I don't pretend to be an expert, no matter how strong my opinions are on this podcast, but I have a pretty basic understanding of the sort of the technical aspects of playing those positions that I don't necessarily have for the cornerback position, and I think that's why I've been off the mark. So I say this because when we get to my issues with Clark Phillips, like his ability to match and mirror in man coverage, part of me wonders, because I don't have that base understanding, is his issues more technical or is it just physical, right? Which is what I kind of perceive it to be. And, if it's just technical, then that's something that should be able to improve with time in the NFL, where he'll get better coaching, or at least theoretically should get better coaching. And so, if a couple of years from now, we may look back at this evaluation, this episode, and say, oh, that's another notch in the Aaron doesn't know how to evaluate cornerbacks belt. Especially if he outperforms my expectations by putting in that work, or he could be exactly what I kind of projected him, which is a nickel only corner that needs to play in a zone heavy scheme, which does not seem to be the scheme that the Falcons are moving towards, or in fact seemingly moving away from that type of scheme, that zone heavy scheme, and going more to a man heavy coverage scheme. So we'll see if that winds up being the case. But I certainly think Clark Phillips is going to be another competitor in the nickel room, along with Mike Hughes, along with D. Alford. And I think that's going to be one of the more fascinating battles to watch this summer. And we've seen, historically speaking, that Hughes tends to be a better outside corner than an inside corner, a nickel corner. And right now I would sit here based off my film study. I don't know if Clark Phillips is bringing a whole lot to the table than what D. Alford brought, or at least based off of what Alford showed in 2022. I would probably argue that Alford probably is a little bit better in man coverage and probably a little bit better in run support in that regard. But we'll see how that battle plays out. And, that will be something to keep an eye on. But, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons episode, we'll talk about the things I liked about Clark Phillips' game, some of my concerns about him, and whether or not those things will help or hurt him as he continues his career here in Atlanta. But first, I want to tell you about Bird Dogs, who provide super comfortable pants, shorts, and sweatpants. And they have stretch khaki shorts that are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, that give you that truly sculpted look. They fit way better than regular shorts that are made of that stiff, restrictive cotton. Bird Dogs invented cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki but stretches so that you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. They use their anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. I got a pair of sweats and shorts myself, and what makes them great is their built-in liners that keep everything, and I mean everything, nice, snug, and cozy. So try them yourself by going to birddogs.com/lockedonnfl. In their promo code LOCKEDONNFL for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That's birddogs.com/LOCKEDONNFL for a free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off, we promise you. So continuing today's Clark Phillips breakdown, let's break down the film and let's start with the good things, right? And the things I liked about Clark Phillips is I thought he was very good in zone coverage. I thought he had great instincts, great awareness when it came to zone. It was clearly reflective that he did his film work in a number of matchups. I note the, USC games where he kind of had his struggles in the first game, and you saw him have, some very positive plays in the second game. And I think that was because he did the homework to learn from his mistakes from that first matchup this past year. He was very excellent, and why he had so much, on ball production with the interceptions and pick sixes because he's very good at jumping those throws on the outside. He's best as an off zone corner when he's able to keep things in front of him. And I think that's the type of skill set that you like in the slot where you'll typically play a lot more off. And this is what, to me, if Clark Phillips is going to exceed my expectations and be more than, say, an average to above average starting nickel cornerback in the NFL. And let me make it clear before you guys get the impression that I think Clark Phillips is bad. I don't think he's bad. I just don't know if he's going to be, this high level top 50 type of talent that you expect in a long time starter in the league. But I think really what the thing that if I look back at this and say, okay, I underestimated Clark Phillips's intangibles, right? Because you read the blurb from Dane Brugler that he put in his draft guide, The Beast, and he wrote notes like an insatiable appetite for film work and prep. Instincts lead him to the football, carries himself with supreme confidence, a goal-oriented person. And we talked with Locked On Utes host JT Wistersill and talked about how Clark had come to Utah with the goal of playing 3 years at Utah and then going to the league and being a high draft pick. And he was able to mostly fulfill that dream, although maybe he didn't get drafted as highly as he initially had set out, but that's something that he doesn't necessarily control. And, this is kind of the shortcoming of what I do here on this podcast, which is I can sit here and watch the film and talk about the player, but I can't really talk about the person. And by all accounts, Clark Phillips is a great person. That was something that the Falcons have pointed out time and time again, that he seems to be wired the right way to succeed in the NFL. And so, when we look at the players that often outperform our expectations, it's often because we underestimate the intangible qualities that they bring to the field. And I may be doing exactly that with Clark Phillips. But let's get to the concerns I have. And I think those concerns based off of, the likelihood that if he were to play outside in the NFL, he would probably struggle because he doesn't necessarily have the high end size or the speed to really match up there, right? He doesn't necessarily do well in press, right? And, generally you would assume that because of, the lack of size, because, there's two kinds of press. Most people usually assume when you say press, you're talking about the classic sort of bump and run, jamming the receiver at the line of scrimmage. And that is certainly one way. The other type of press is you just line up close to the line of scrimmage and you just basically rely on your athleticism to mirror those guys. AJ Terrell is more the latter type of good press corner that has the athleticism to mirror those guys. And to me, Clark Phillips on his film really kind of struggled in those situations where he was asked to sort of mirror those guys that had very effective release packages, were very effective at getting on top of him, stacking him, and beating him down the field because of, some of those limitations with the speed and whatnot. And, I don't think that's going to be a major issue playing in the slot as I project him to, and most people do, because, historically, that's why teams tend to put smaller receivers in the slot. That's the sort of stereotype on slot receivers, is that they're small guys that can't win against press because, generally speaking, slot corners don't press you. And so I don't think, Clark Phillips's limitations in press are going to be that much of an issue if he plays in the slot. Right. And I think the slot can kind of mask some of those size speed concerns. Like you look at a player like Isaiah Oliver, like the big reason why, to me, Oliver went from struggling on the outside and succeeding on the inside as a slot corner was because the speed limitations that Isaiah Oliver got exposed regularly on the outside. And on the interior, you're not really seeing a whole lot of deep routes from, slot receivers. And so, if speed is a concern for Clark Phillips, it shouldn't be something that is going to really hurt him in the slot as it would on the outside. But it is worth noting that because he may lack this ability to play on the outside, the less versatility you bring to the NFL, the potentially it limits you and you kind of get pigeonholed where you can only do one thing. And you increase your chances of being able to stick on an NFL roster if you can do 2 or 3 or 4 things. And I think that's going to be a concern for Clark Phillips because he can only do kind of one thing. And so piggybacking off of the mirroring point, I'm not sure he's quite athletic enough to go up against some of the smaller, quicker wide receivers either that he's probably going to face a lot in the slot. As I said, those receivers with those refined release packages tended to do a good job beating him off the line of scrimmage. And he didn't necessarily have the fluidity and quickness that I thought you needed in order to recover when he lost at the line of scrimmage. And so that's why I thought he was much better in an off zone sort of scheme where he could just keep things in front of him. He could read the things in front of him and react to those things rather than trying to react on the fly. And so, one of the other concerns I have for Clark Phillips playing in the slot, where I think some of these issues in coverage will get masked. But one issue that won't is the run support stuff. And I thought his tackling was very poor this past year at Utah. I also thought his effort when it came was, perfunctory at best, right? It was very questionable. He was very inconsistent wrapping up. And I am one of those weirdos, and this is my own bias, that does care about cornerbacks and run support. I know other people don't really care because their job is to cover, and they can care less about whether or not you bring it in run support. For me, I if you're a high level cover corner, I will care less about run support because you can more than make up. The positive that you bring in coverage is going to make up for the quote unquote negative that you bring in run support. But because of the concerns I've addressed with Clark Phillips, I don't know if he's ever going to be that high level cover corner. So I do care specifically for him that he does need to bring more in run defense. And that can be an issue if you're the nickel, because, we know in the NFL that, teams, you're in the nickel, you have to be able to add value in run support because you're replacing a linebacker from the base defense. And while you don't necessarily have to be an elite run defender, you don't want to be a liability. And I thought Phillips too often was kind of a liability. And that's not going to be a problem against every NFL team because there's certain offenses that aren't necessarily designed to exploit that. But there are offenses out there in the league, and a lot of them being high level offenses that will exploit that, will force you to play nickel by going with 11 personnel, and they will run it down your throat. A team like Philadelphia is a great example of that, right? And so that could be a major issue against some of those quality competitions, like an Eagles defense going up against the Eagles offense in the future. So, this is why when I look at Clark Phillips, like when I project him, and part of the reason why I was much higher on him in December was because at that time, Dean Pease was the Falcons defensive coordinator. And I thought, yeah, in a zone heavy Dean Pease style scheme, he'd be a really good fit as a nickel corner, even despite some of the concerns in run support. Right. But now that the Falcons have hired Ryan Nielsen, in the expectation, and maybe this expectation is false, maybe we learned that Ryan Nielsen was like, you know what? I left New Orleans because I hate all the man coverage that they play, and I just want to play zone all day long. Maybe that's the case, but it doesn't seem like that's the case. And it seems like the Falcons will be moving towards more man coverage under Ryan Nielsen. And I do think that may be something that limits Clark Phillips's potential, and will break down what his potential is by comparing him to some NFL players and talk about his floor, his ceiling, and his eye level as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But guys, I want to give another shout out to my everydayers that make this podcast their first listen. And tomorrow we'll be joined by a guest. He is the fourth member of the New Millennium Falcons podcast. We've had several of his cohorts like Hunter Thompson and Trayshawn Diaz and Savion Mixon. And that is, of course, Fleek. You may know him as Ron Rico Season on Twitter. And he is our guest on tomorrow. And we'll talk about some of the things that he is excited to watch for this Falcon team this season and this summer on tomorrow's episode. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, and before we get to the player comparisons, I do want to talk about, whether or not Clark Phillips can get better in some of these areas of concern. Like, can he improve against the run? Absolutely, right? But to me, it was clear in college that he was making business decisions. And to me, that's forgivable when he was such a critical part of Utah's defense in terms of being their top cover corner. And so, like, you don't need to be throwing your quote unquote tiny body around, trying to, be Devin Witherspoon or whatnot when it comes to run support. And it's going to be questionable whether Devin Witherspoon can play we note that Devin Witherspoon was a dog when it came to being that guy in run support and all these various things. And it's a question of whether Devin Witherspoon at his smaller size can play that way in the NFL and hold up. He dealt with some injuries in college, that may be exacerbated in the NFL. So I get it why Clark Phillips, if your goal is to get to the NFL, you can't play if you're not available. Right. So I get the business decisions that he seemingly was making when it came to run support, but I don't think he's going to be able to get away with that in the NFL. Like, you have to bring it. Like, they will find someone who's better than you if you're consistently a liability when it comes to tackling and making plays. And, it'll be interesting to see how this regime deals with it, how Clark Phillips deals with it. Cause I know under the Dan Quinn regime, that was a talking point that Dan Quinn often preached, that we can teach improved tackling technique. And I thought, for the most part, at least at the cornerback position, maybe not other positions, but at the cornerback position, players like Robert Alford and Desmond Trufant were better tacklers under Dan Quinn than they were in previous coaching staffs. And that was something that they were able to teach. Does the Arthur Smith regime feel the same? I don't know. We'll just have to sort of see. So The other issue is my concerns with Clark Phillips and man coverage. Like, is that something that can improve, as I said earlier, with improved technique, with more polish on his technique? And I don't know the answer to that. Again, that's where my shortcomings as a cornerback evaluator come. And, the reason why I tend to be skeptical is because his middling, let's say, athletic testing makes me less optimistic that, you know, with improved technique, he's still not going to be limited there, right? Like, he's just kind of an average athlete at the cornerback position, and that usually doesn't bode well to being a high level corner in the NFL. But we'll springboard into the player comps, and it basically boils down to, I think, Clark Phillips needing to be more of an outlier to be a high level NFL player. Because when I try to look at NFL player comps of guys that had similar size and athletic testing, there weren't a whole lot of success stories. And usually the guys that had similar size that did go on to be more successful in the NFL were guys that tested much better. Like, kind of when I watched Clark Phillips, I was like, yeah, he's kind of like Asante Samuel. Like, he's a Asante Samuel light, but Asante was a much better cover corner and man cover guy and athlete than we probably give credit, because we know Asante loved jumping routes and doing all that stuff. And Clark kind of has a similar style of play, but I don't know if Clark can hold up in man coverage in the same ways that Asante was able to hold up in man coverage that led to Asante being as productive and as successful in the NFL as he wound up being. So we'll just have to sort of see how that goes. But for those of you that are new here, I do these floor, ceiling, and eye level comps for the player. And the floor is what I think a player is day one entering the NFL. So what you can expect from him their rookie season, the minute they step on the field. The ceiling to me is what the max potential of the player could be with development, with the best case scenario for that player. And the eye level to me is the halfway point between the floor and the ceiling, which to me is a much more accurate projection of what the player is likely to be, because he'll get some development, so he'll rise above his floor, but may not meet all the conditions and circumstances that he needs to have the best case scenario, which is reaching that ceiling. And so my floor for Clark Phillips is Chris Owens. I love my former Falcon player comps, and Owens and Phillips were similar size players. I think Owens was probably a slightly better athlete, but we saw Chris Owens really struggle to rise above being a fourth corner here in Atlanta. He was a third round pick out of San Jose back in 2009. He wound up playing like 7 years in the NFL, but I think mostly that was due to the fact that Chris Owens was a good special teams player, a great gunner or a very good gunner on punt coverage. And so he kept getting opportunities in the NFL, even if his impact on defense was very limited. I'm not sure Clark Phillips is going to have that. We'll circle back to that a little bit later. And so to me, the floor for Clark Phillips is a guy that probably won't win the nickel cornerback spot, but in the event of an injury, like we saw several times over Chris Owens' first 4 years in Atlanta, that if the actual nickel gets hurt, you plug in Clark Phillips as a good backup, right? And he can hold his own, right? He can tread water, right? He'll have his ups and downs. I'm sure many of you still wake up in cold sweats in the middle of the night thinking about what Greg Jennings and Donald Driver did to Chris Owens in that playoff game, 13 years ago or 12 years ago, I guess it was. I'm hoping for a little bit better than Clark Phillips on that, but just kind of a depth guy that just doesn't bring a whole lot in terms of being one of the top three corners. That's kind of the floor I expect for Clark Phillips. So we'll see about that. Now, again, Owens was able to impact on special teams, so him being the fourth corner didn't really impact his ability to play on Sundays. That may be an issue for Clark Phillips moving forward. But looking at the best case scenario, the ceiling comp for Clark Phillips was Valdosta State legend Kenny Moore. Very similar athlete and profile to Phillips. Moore was an undrafted free agent, by the way. But what stands out to me about Kenny Moore and his success in Indianapolis, he's been very good there as a starter there. But Indianapolis, primarily over the course of his career, has primarily been a zone-heavy defense. First under Matt Eberflus, and now under Gus Bradley. And Moore has been a very reliable, solid starter for the Colts for the last 5 years. That to me is kind of the ceiling for Phillips. Reliable starter, very good production. Moore has 14 interceptions, 49 pass breakups over the last 6 years. He earned a Pro Bowl spot in 2021. So that's a player that I think Phillips has the capability of being, but I don't think most people would look at Kenny Moore as an elite cornerback, but a very solid cornerback, certainly an above average starter in the league, particularly because of his ability in the nickel. But I do think that scheme is very friendly to Kenny Moore that allows him to put his best foot forward in Indianapolis, that I don't know if the Falcons scheme is going to allow that, again, going back to the man versus zone thing here for Clark Phillips. So we'll just sort of have to see. Now, again, maybe we see a switch in schemes in the short time, and then Clark Phillips is able to reach that ceiling as I projected, because the Falcons at some point, either because Ryan Nielsen, realizes that he likes the zone more, or it fits his personnel better, or there's a change in defensive coordinators at some point that will allow Clark Phillips to reach that ceiling. So we'll see. So that leaves us for our eye level for Clark Phillips. For me, that was Brian Poole. And Poole and Phillips aren't necessarily comparable athletically, because Poole's like 20 pounds heavier coming into the NFL, and Poole kind of had like safety-like skills. And I frankly think the Falcons' original plan for Brian Poole was to develop him as a safety, but because of the Jalen Collins suspension at the beginning of 2016, they kind of needed him to pull his weight at the nickel cornerback. We saw Poole do that for 3 years and was mostly solid in that role. But to me, the notable thing about Brian Poole was, as time wore on, and the Falcons went more towards more man coverage towards the end of 2016, 2017, and 2018, you started to see the limitations of Brian Poole, right? And the conversations surrounding Brian Poole for most of that time, at the end of 2016 through 2018, was always about, well, Brian Poole's solid, but can we do better? And that, to me, is kind of where I kind of project a Clark Phillips in the style of defense that, I expect the Falcons to play, right? Again, Brian Poole was a fine nickel cornerback that was able to pull his weight, but you always felt like you could do a little bit better, and that led to the Falcons, bringing in Casey and Kendall Sheffield, and eventually, settling on Isaiah Oliver there, and now we're back to the drawing board with Alford and Hughes and now Clark Phillips. So I feel like Clark Phillips can be a solid, quote-unquote, starter for the Falcons for multiple years over the course of his rookie contract, but by the time we get to, 3-4 years from now, we'll be potentially looking at trying to find some upgrades there. So we'll see if Clark Phillips can do that and follow in the Brian Poole footsteps. But that's kind of the eye level I have for Clark Phillips. And I think for Clark Phillips, it's going to be important for him to win the nickel job sooner versus later, right? Because it goes back to not having that positional versatility. I don't think the Falcons are going to be like, if Clark Phillips is starting games on the outside for the Falcons, that to me tells me that something has gone horribly wrong for the Falcons, whether that's injuries or just someone really underperforming for the team this year or next year or whatever. And so I think Phillips needs to win that starting nickel cornerback job, because again, I don't know if he's going to have a substantial role on special teams, right? I don't know if he's going to be the type of guy that you want as a gunner on punt coverage, right? Because, the tackling is going to be, to me, a concern there. Now, maybe he proves me wrong in that, but I feel like if he can't carve out a role in special teams, he's not going to really have opportunities to play on game day if he's not one of the top 3 corners on this roster. And so, again, to me, the clearest path for him to be one of those top 3 guys is to win that nickel cornerback job. And it doesn't necessarily mean that he has to do it this summer, although obviously I think he'll be putting his best foot forward if he does. But, certainly within the next year or so, by year 2, you would want to see him make that leap to solidify that spot. And if not by by the summer of 2024, and Clark Phillips doesn't have a firm grip on that nickel cornerback spot, I could see the Falcons looking to move on and try to upgrade, not too long after, a year or 2 after that point. So we'll just sort of have to see how that goes with Clark Phillips. Again, I think he can be an effective player for the Falcons, but similar to Brian Poole, I don't know if you're going to be married to Clark Phillips, for long term. The potential is there. We see it with Kenny Moore. And again, this goes back to the conversation of, how much improvement and how much am I underestimating Clark Phillips's intangibles, but we'll just have to sort of see how that goes, guys. That's going to do it for us here with our Clark Phillips breakdown. Again, a player I like, but I don't know if this particular scheme and this particular situation here in Atlanta that we have, if we had drafted Clark Phillips a year ago, I'd be singing his praises, I think. But now with the scheme change, I don't know if I love the fit quite to the degree that, maybe others do. But we'll just sort of see if he exceeds my expectations, as I said, and another notch in the belt of Aaron doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to cornerbacks. But that's going to do it for us here, breaking down Clark Phillips. We still have 2 more draft picks to go. We'll probably get to those probably next week. on the podcast probably early in the week, and we'll be able to wrap up this Falcons draft class. But tomorrow's episode, we'll be joined by a guest in Fleek of the New Millennium Falcons podcast to talk about the things that he's excited and the things that gives him a little bit of trepidation heading into training camp next month for the Atlanta Falcons. So continue to make us your first listen, of course, on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And also check out the Locked On NFL podcast for your second listen, also on the same podcast platforms like YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.